Welcome to So and So, brought to you by BERNINA, made to create. I'm Meg Goodman, and you're about to enjoy a casual conversation with a special member of the sewist and quilting community. A conversation about how they got started, what inspires them, what excites them, and their connection to this community. Summer 2024 is a special time for the world, as it's a year of the Summer Olympics to be held in Paris, France. Approximately 10,500 athletes will compete in 329 events, representing 32 sports. Several of those sports will feature rowing in one form or another, and if you watch this year's Olympic and Paralympic trials, the voice of our guest for this episode will be very familiar. Today we sit down with Grace Latz, who was on America's 2016 Olympic team, placing 5th in the quadruple sculls. A much decorated rower, she was on 4 national teams, the 2015 World Rowing Championship, and walked on the team at the University of Wisconsin-Madison to eventually help the team win their first Big Ten championship in women's rowing. She'll be in a different role this year as one of 4 Olympians selected for the Paris 2024 Olympian Artist-in-Residence Program to implement collaborative and community-based art. Through reassembling donated uniforms and equipment from Olympic sports through a local recycling center, she created a large-scale tapestry of the Olympic rings with the support of senior Parisian citizens in the lead-up to the 2024 Olympics. The piece will be on display during the Games at Clubhouse 24 and will subsequently be part of the collection of the Olympic Museum in Lausanne, Switzerland. Hi, Grace, and welcome to So and So.
Thank you for having me.
This is exciting. It's timely, and this I'm very interested in what we're going to talk about. So we have a lot to talk about today. We're going to talk about you as an athlete, and then your sewing, and then we're going to talk about this amazing project with the Olympics. And you're off to Paris soon, so we appreciate you sitting down with us today. Now, unlike your previous trip as an athlete, this time you're more of an ambassador with the Olympic Artists Program. But this trip wouldn't have happened if you hadn't learned how to sew. So how did you learn how to sew?
Yeah, you're right. So I learned how to sew from my mother and my grandmother, from my father's mother. And my mother grew up making clothes. I think that was of her time and her upbringing. And when I was young, she continued to make clothes for herself and for me. She got into quilting when she moved to the Midwest. And through my father's family, my grandmother was an avid quilter, made a quilt for every grandchild. And then actually my aunt through my father is a quilt artist, Becky Keck. And I feel like I've just been surrounded by a lot of quilting specifically, and had always been in my periphery as I think a average Midwesterner is. So I knew of some of the basics of sewing. I really like working with my hands. And I would say I was probably more drawn to other fiber arts first with knitting and crocheting. But then
Mm-hmm.
as I got older, really liked being able to build like more structural and larger things through sewing. And with my mom's background in doing a lot of clothing and just being around quilting in general, I think a lot of these ideas sort of like percolated over time. So I've always had a sewing machine. I was that kid in college who was toting around that to my different dorm rooms or sublets. And when I was training afterwards, after I graduated college, I always had both a sewing machine and setup, and then also a toolkit because I just like to make things in general. And sewing is one of those mediums that I use to be able to express myself.
And you talk about quilting, and we're going to get into what you've done for the Olympics. But this isn't your traditional quilting that you do now. I mean, people kind of have a picture in their mind of what quilting looks like, but that's not quite what you do.
No, and I'm laughing because I typical to me, and it's something that I think used to drive my mom insane. But I I don't love sewing just like straight lines and having all my angles match up and following a pattern. So I know that I ran through the basics and understanding the processes through doing these other projects that you would consider traditional quilting. And I would admit that I'm probably not the most proficient quilter when it comes to traditional quilting. Um, but I think by learning those essentials and those kind of standards and processes, that's helped me kind of adapt them into a new presentation. So I enjoy things being a little bit loose and a little bit surprising and fun. And so I use those traditional ways in an untraditional outcome. So, yeah, with this piece, it's a take on an art quilt that's a t-shirt quilt. We know a lot of that from the US, especially in high school and college, people collecting their shirts from different sporting events or different achievements and
Hmm.
reassembling them in a way that is usable as a quilt that you would use on a bed or a couch or something like that. But for me, I was like, I think it would be really interesting to broaden that scope of collecting more of that kind of textile, using it in a new way and
Hmm.
presenting it in a new way that's outside of kind of a domestic space. And like, how can you do that? So that kind of gives a peek behind the curtains of how I came about with the project that's the outcome for this Olympic program, but also what I've done um, before that, which has been a lot of, you know, different fabric collage or different things with batiks, or it's often this art quilt is what I'm drawn to.
Hmm.
Um, just to be able to have that flexibility and creativity by not having to stick to straight lines outside of the binding. Um, just because I find that just a new take on things.
And I'm going to quote you here. You have called this, you love to do traditional processes with non-traditional
Hmm.
materials plus surprising combinations.
Yeah.
And that's what you're talking about. Is there an example of something that you've created that would exemplify what you've talked about here?
Well, I mean, obviously this project, and we'll get more into the details of that, I think is one of them. Because oftentimes when I've done these types of art quilts and collages, I've used batiks because they're the same on the front and the back of the fabric based on how it's dyed. Um, and I'm able to cut them into small pieces. I don't have to worry which side is the right side or the wrong side. I can sprinkle them. I can maybe be more precise by using some adhesive to the back of it, but it's very flexible. Um, when trying to figure out, well, how do I adapt this art form to a sports context, I realized that sports material is also equally dyed, or the fabric has that same value and dye front and back as well.
Hmm.
So being able to use the qualities or like the parallels between things in a new way. So you wouldn't usually see sports jerseys in an art quilt, but the properties of it act the same way as a batik. So why not? Um, Another thing that I've done that's maybe not so much sewing, but has been fiber arts in general was I remember when I was in college for both an art studio project, but then also for an environmental studies class, I collected hundreds and hundreds of plastic bags my from my I guess sweetmates from the grocery store or the pharmacy and things like that, and then stripped them down with groups because people were like, "What are you doing? Why are you collecting all these bags?" And they're interested in the process, so I put them to work, and we cut all these things into long strips and um, rolled and braided them into a long seemingly plastic yarn, and then recreated a series of plastic bags out of plastic bags. So again, it's this using of a familiar but somewhat non-traditional material in a
Hmm.
new way that's recognizable, that is fun, it's engaging, it brings people in, and it's a little bit surprising. So I feel like even though it's not been maybe the same thing every time, I think it's the same process and the same things that I look for of, well, how does this material act similar to something that I've worked with before? And
Hmm.
that's kind of the thread that ties it together.
Now, you've said that your work is collaborative and made with many hands. What does that mean?
So I think often with art, sometimes people get um, focused on whose signature is at the bottom, who,
Mm.
you know, eh, you've got your Leonardo da Vinci's, you've got your, where it's clearly the hand of the master who's made it. Something personally that I really enjoy is kind of, again, breaking that mold and seeing, well, who truly owns the idea. And that's kind of a modern art concept. I studied a lot of art history when I was in college and have always been a bit of an art nerd. But, is it does it have to be made by one person to be considered high quality craft?
Mm-hmm.
Can it be something that's shared because it's capturing a moment, it's capturing experience, it's capturing a moment where like all of these people come together to create something? So, like, for the example, for that one plastic bag project that I was talking about, initially it was something that was going to start off with just me, but it was a lot more fun to share it in that process. And it got a lot more people engaged in further discussion. And it's the same thing that's happened with this Olympic project or some of these other things that I've done. I think people are naturally curious and naturally creative, but don't always have the opportunity to exercise that muscle. So
Mm-hmm.
I really enjoy bringing people into that and seeing what kind of comes up of that. Because even with this Olympic project, I had a specific idea in mind that not everyone saw the vision of at first. But as I got through the process and started doing some of these things, they were still a little bit lost, but I could see what they were doing and how they were interpreting certain elements. And then fun, surprising things come out of it that I didn't even foresee. So I get a lot out of sharing the creative making process with other people because I don't have all the answers. I don't think there's a creative genius. I think a lot of this comes out of maybe this is just being primed as a team athlete, somebody who always likes working with others and being open to their perspectives, bringing something to the table that I didn't even foresee.
And now you've talked about your art and how you see things, and we're about to get into your Olympic athletes artist in residence program. But it would be remiss of me, and I know our listeners are thinking about this. What's it like to be an Olympic athlete?
Yeah, it's I was talking about this with my husband. I think for me, it's sometimes it's surreal, and sometimes I um, forget about it in some instances because it's a path that you're on for, at least within the sport of rowing, a very long time.
Hmm.
So, like I said, and like you alluded to, I started as a walk-on athlete when I found the sport when I was at freshman orientation, signing up for freshman year classes, walked into the next room where there's extracurriculars, and rowing was kitty corner from the entrance of that 500 person orientation. They mark the door with where 6 foot is on the door frame. And as you walk around this room with a bunch of people, they say, because I mean, it's true, we spotted you when you walked in. You might be good at rowing. And at least at Wisconsin, they say, you know, you could be really good at this. You could be an Olympian, because it's a fact for the program that there's always been a Badger rower in the Olympics since 1968.
Oh,
And so
wow.
I probably took them a little too literally. I was the
You
only
did.
Badger from my Olympic year, but I think that set the pace. I learned to row there, and then it was 10 years of practice and mastery and competition and putting myself out there between starting and being at the start line of the Olympic Games. And I continued on for another few years after that. But once you've dedicated yourself to that process, you're in a pretty small circle of people who are that a little bit crazy.
Hmm.
So I was a lot of my training partners and friends were Olympians, either within the sport of rowing, because it is a long process. It's a very time intensive. It's very much based on your ability to gel with others,
Hmm.
both personality, but also like physically and with your technique. But then also through being an Olympian and have gone to the games, and then have since gone to some other things where it's open to Olympians from and Paralympians from different sports. It's really fascinating. On one hand, I feel surrounded and have access to more people who've shared this mindset that have gotten them to this place. But then I also see that same intensity or that same way of going about things, of wanting to master something, of wanting to pursue something with diligence and excellence in a lot of other means. So I know that I get the honor of being recognized as an Olympian, but I also see that same I see that same thread through other people. So I think in one ways it's obviously a huge honor to be an Olympian. I'll hold that for the rest of my life. Um, but in other ways, I think it's just an outward thing that people recognize. Okay, this person has dedicated a lot of time of mastering like a very specific endeavor. Um, and when I tell people, usually one of two things happens. Either one, they're completely floored and they've never met an Olympian before, or they've gone in passing with somebody and they ask me if I know them because I forget how small that world is.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there's that. But then the second option of what happens is then it opens up these conversations of, you know, learning more about what they're doggedly passionate about and where that's taken them. And both are really cool conversations to have with people. And I think, I get to proudly wear my passion on my arm and on my chest. So, and people see that. And I think it just opens the door for people to talk about what they're really passionate about chasing.
You are one of a small, very elite group that obviously you work very hard to become a part of and stay there and go to the Olympics representing us. So thanks for sharing that. It's something that we rarely get an opportunity to talk to people about. Now, subsequently, you were chosen as one of four Olympic athletes to participate this year in the Olympic Artist-in-Residence Program. Would you tell us about that program and then how you were chosen to participate?
Yeah, so I believe that the Olympian Artist Program began in 2018. There have always been some sort of ties between art and sport at every Olympics, going back to the very first modern Olympics in those, late 1800s, early 1900s. And I think they're more combined than people realize. It has to do with, the brand of the Olympic rings and all of the taking this really big idea and applying it to a local setting, either to align it with what the venue is, site is. You see a lot of the artwork through posters or maybe some sculptures and installments. If you visit a former host city, you see a lot of remnants of that art still present. But the Olympian Artist Program in 2018 was the first time they formalized engaging Olympians from around the world to create something for that particular games. For 2018 and for 2020 at least, they were initially starting it with just basically like a studio art call or, an artist going out, making their thing and giving it to the IOC or that venue to be on display. I had applied and received the Tokyo 2021, but obviously with the pandemic, it wasn't possible for me to implement my project because while a different idea than the one I've done now, it was very collaborative. And so obviously not something that could be pursued. But I think that got the gears turning for that program because the Olympic Committee is really focused on engaging people around the Olympic values and what they deem as Olympism. So friendship and respect, strength, there's, the whole curriculum dedicated to the values that um, Olympism and sport can teach the world. So I recall then getting notified that they were having a call to action to apply for the 2024 iteration of the Olympian Artist Program. And it took me, a couple of days to think about like, do I have something? I was always, I had something in the back of my mind. Oh, if this program ever comes up again, what would I do? But it wasn't coming to me until they announced it. And about a week later, I was sitting at my dining room table and my husband asked me about it again. He's like, hey, do you have anything in mind for this project? Cause like, it was so exciting to have received it before. And, you always come up with great ideas. What's going on in there? And this idea came to me and I said, I think I've got it. And I worked, a couple of renderings. I did a couple of test projects to see like, okay, will this process work? And put together my application for my proposal, included a couple of renderings, and kind of how I wanted to engage people because it was the first time with this Olympian Artist Program that they had two directions. One was specific to about engaging communities and local people ahead of the Olympic Games through art. And the other one was still in the same vein as what was previously of artists executing a project and sending it in um, for those games, and I still wanted to work with local people. So I applied. I didn't hear for some time, but then I learned over last summer that I had been chosen as one of four out of 100 applicants of Olympians from around the world,
Wow.
um, to do this project. So I was over the moon about it. To get it twice was very exciting, and I've only recently learned who the other artists were, and I hope to meet them either in Paris or, actually, funny enough, one of those four outside of me is actually another American rower who lives in the state of Michigan, who's a professor at Michigan State for graphic design, but she really only lives about an hour away from me. So it just goes to show you how small the world is. But yeah, so that was that was the process of getting it, and from then on out it was just planning and logistics. I really love making sure things are organized. For as free as free as my application of art is, I think it's executed with a good plan. So there was a lot behind the scenes in preparation before I actually arrived in Paris in November to do this workshop with senior citizens in Paris to be able to do this project.
So let's keep going. I'd love to hear more about this project. You worked with a local recycling center. You worked with senior citizens in Paris. There were a lot of moving parts to this. So tell us more.
Yeah, uh, all to do with good planning. I think that's me leaning on my athletic background of making a training plan and setting some goals and then breaking it down to smaller steps. But yes, so the IOC, for them, it was very important that I work with local materials, engage local businesses, and engage local organizations. So from the very beginning of my proposal, I specifically wanted to work with senior citizens because I think often when we think about sports and we think about just the visuals and the audiences engaged through the Olympics, the focus is a lot on, the vigor of youth, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
bigger, faster, stronger, world records, peak of the game, and then inspiring the youth to follow in their footsteps. But that kind of excludes a very large category of people who have set the stage for those achievements to be had. So I think of, you have your mentors, you have your coaches, you have former athletes who set the bar ahead of you. You have your supporters, you have people who unknowingly maybe did something that made it available to you to have this opportunity. So I wanted to work with seniors because I think that older populations get forgotten when we think about sports, but they're really the reason why we have, amateur sports or youth sports or,
Mm-hmm.
um, you know, especially women. I'm very aware of this through my mother and my mother's mother, but didn't have the opportunity to pursue sports because of just the times.
Mm-hmm.
My mom didn't have any, there were no sports girls could engage in when she was in high school. And then for my grandmother, she was a very accomplished ballet dancer, had an invitation to go to train with the American Ballet Theater. But her parents said, no, there's no way we're going to support a daughter who dances for money.
Oh my.
And, that's a product of the time, right? That's the late 30s.
Sure.
And so my mom talks about this, but being able to pursue those opportunities, my mom was never going to say no to me because she knew what harm that had done for her mother. And her mother had tried to do as much as she could for my mother. And then through those steps, I was able to pursue a lot of different athletic activities when I was younger and eventually led to being able to be on this stage. And it was because of that population of, people who laid that road ahead of me. So I wanted to work with senior citizens. The IOC had identified a specific senior center in the 18th arrondissement in Montmartre, which is it's where Sacré-Cœur is. It's actually one of like those older art quarters within
Mm-hmm.
Paris. So,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, my Airbnb was right around the corner from Picasso's first studio in Paris. I was
Oh
walking the same
wow.
streets that Van Gogh and Renoir had walked through. So that in itself was incredibly inspiring. Like I alluded to, I'm a huge art nerd, so I was very excited to just be in those spaces. Um, so th- I was walking the streets of Paris every day for this basically week long marathon of completing this project. When I arrived, the IOC had organized that I meet with a recycling center just outside the city limits who specifically collect sport material and equipment. So I arrived there. We sorted through just bins and bins and bins of tons of different types of donated items. And I was looking for textiles from sports that are part of the Olympic program, but anything that a needle could punch through. So I had taekwondo jackets, there were beach volleyball uniforms, there was a basketball net, swim caps, anything of that sort. And socks, clothing tags, just anything that would have to do with Olympic sports. So collected those, took them to the senior center, and through the next 5 days after that, myself and my mother, so my mother joined me, we sorted those textiles, ripped them apart, which was very unnerving for the women we were working with. They're like, why are we ripping apart these perfectly good clothes? Sorted them by color, and in 2 days we sorted the background, which was a majority of white, and then we sorted the other colors that were very, very colorful into smaller pieces. And eventually on the third day of the 5 days, we started to create the rings. So for the first 3 days, I think the women I was working with at the senior center were very enthusiastic and excited. They loved meeting and talking with me, had a little presentation about like what is quilting, but also understanding this is kind of a non-traditional take on a traditional art form. And they just enjoyed being in each other's company and working with their hands in each other and having these conversations. But we're kind of like, I don't know what this crazy American's doing. But by the third day where we started to make the rings, then they were like, oh, okay, now we see it come together. And so after those rings were completed, I then would pack up all of the rings and the backgrounds. I would schlep it via the metro to a sewing store that actually BERNINA connected me with to use their Q24 long arm, and started to kind of create that sandwich to sew. So then I would schlep it back and forth between the sewing center and the senior center. And then by the fifth day, I was able to present the women with what we were making. And it was still attached to, the supports of the machine and everything. So it wasn't finished off completely, but it was such a moment to be able to reveal to them what it was, because they were just working on these small bits that were maybe the size of their hands, or there was even, I called it fabric confetti, the pieces that were smaller than a dime. And then to see it in this large piece, the overall size is about 6 feet by 10 feet. They were completely blown away of, wow, we've been focusing on just these small bits, these little steps, and like, look at what we created together. They were blown away. And the first thing they did when we counted down and revealed it was they immediately went to go and touch it, because it was their hands who made it, right? So I love that was their immediate response to it. And they like, oh, I remember cutting this piece or doing that bit, or I didn't know that this is how this was going to turn out. So I found that was a really wonderful and rewarding moment. And so we all took pictures. We had croissants you have to when in France.
Of course you did. Of course.
And but then I had to pack it back up, because I was like, I gotta finish out this. Gotta cut it up, put the binding on, and get it on its way. But at that point, it was in a place where all the women could sign the label, and we had about 30 or so names on the back, because it was about 30 or so people who contributed to it. So that was a pretty fantastic experience. Kind of rounds out at least the day-to-day of what it was like to make it. My mom, God bless her, she was this whole time was like, okay, Grace, like I understand what you're saying. I understand the ideas. You're showing me the steps. I have no idea what we're making.
A leap of
so
faith,
I felt,
right?
it was a definite leap of faith, but I know that she knows how to do things like very methodically and very thoroughly. So she was my accountability check to make sure that, the processes were being followed. But I did feel like for a while, the crazy artist who has the vision that no one sees until the last minute when it starts to come together. But once she started to see it, then it all like really the pace picked up, and it was really cool to be able to finish something that big, um, with the help of a lot of people, my mom included, uh, and definitely not something I could have executed on my own. So I think that goes back to with quilting, you've got quilting bees, right? Or
Hmm.
it's naturally a collaborative sort of art or craft. So I thought it was really fitting to be able to use that through this program to create such a piece. And so it's something I didn't talk about, but it's 6 feet by 10 feet. That seems like a really weird dimension, but the proportions are such that the end product creates essentially an oversized Olympic flag with the Olympic rings on it.
Hmm.
So that's why it's not like a king size or a queen size. Um, so I wanted it to be grand because the materials I was using, these recycled textiles, are human scale, right? Like the text that's printed on a 5K fun run shirt is a certain size. And if you cut it up too small, you're never going to recognize that text, that copy,
Hmm.
that imagery. It'll get lost. So I knew it had to be a certain size relative to the human scale. So I did have to really fight and advocate for it to be that large. And I knew it was quite ambitious, but with good planning and being able to set the process in such a way, I knew it could be accomplished if we had a lot of people buy into it. So that was one of the reasons why it was so great to accomplish it with a big group.
And it's 6 by 10.
Hmm.
That's that's notable. That's notable.
Yes.
So do you know, Grace, if any of the women that helped you on this project will be able to travel to see this displayed at the Olympics?
I truly hope so. I think, I did actually send an email out to my contact, the program lead for at the IOC about that because, they are really invested in engaging people genuinely and authentically around the games. So I think it's not off the table. And really, I mean, logistically speaking, their quadrant of Paris is really only about a 30-minute subway ride
Hmm.
south to where this venue will be so it'll be portrayed or displayed at Clubhouse 24, which is one of the IOC hospitality venues.
Hmm.
So I hope that they get to see it in the space along with the other artists' work. Um, because I know that after I finished it, it was hung in their senior center for a few months. But I think it traveled for a little bit and then arrived at this venue. So it's been some time since they've seen it, and I think it would be cool for them to see it amidst the context of all this other Olympism in that in that hospitality space. I think that's maybe an experience they didn't know they'd have access to. So
Hmm.
I'm gonna put it out there into the universe that I hope they do get to see it.
It's a well-traveled piece besides traveling with you on the metro.
Yeah.
Uh, then it got to travel independently and really just share your creativity with many, and there are many more that get to experience it. Now you're headed over to Paris soon. Um, as in your role as one of the Olympians, part of this program, what are some of the things that you get to do while you're over there?
Yeah, so I will be part of the opening for this hospitality space, and I think specifically the gallery that these different artworks will be presented at. So it'll be alongside the other artworks from the other three artists who did collaborative projects. It'll be, I think, in the same space as the other artists who submitted their works as well for that second direction of the Olympian Artist Program.
Hmm.
There will be a couple of interviews lined up that'll be either shown at that space in that venue or potentially on the Olympic Broadcasting Channel. There will be a couple of, I think, engagement activities either at the venue or through different hospitality spaces. So, like Team USA will have a house, and the World Olympians Association will have a house, and there could be stuff there. So I know that the focus of the games is truly on the athletes and the logistics of this huge event. But there are those few things that I know that are going to happen, but I'm leaving it open to see to welcome any kind of last minute or kind of surprise things that occur because you just never know who you run into when you go to a big event like this. So we will see. I am trying to figure out if I can meet up with the citizens again at that
Hmm.
senior center, or even the sewing store, because they were really instrumental in being able to execute this project. And I didn't mention this before, but in the planning stages of this project, um, I was going back and forth to the IOC with like specific materials and equipment that I needed, and they were excellent with finding, the specific recycle center for these materials and
Hmm.
the specific, senior center that's accessible from here or there. Like that logistics was great, but they were not familiar with sewing machines. So they were like, "Well, here at the senior center, we found this in the basement. How does this work?" And it was like it was it was just a really small, maybe like $50 sewing machine. And I was
Hmm.
like, ooh, I hate to break it to you, but I'm not like, while this is a sewing machine, it is not what I can use to reasonably finish this on time.
Hmm.
So after a lot of searching, I ended up contacting BERNINA, just submitting a couple emails to things I had found, and eventually then, got in contact with you. But then through that, also launched into finding their current VP of marketing, who said, we do have a shop in Paris that has a lot of these machines. And actually, the machine that you're looking for, this sewing center is the only one in France who has that machine,
Oh,
and
how about that?
they have it on display in their shop. And I was like, there could not have been a more perfect, universes coming together for that to happen. And that only really actualized a few weeks before I left. So I was getting pretty nervous before I left of would I be able to find the right machine to do this project on, because I had used my mother's sit down long arm at home. That's a Bernina, so I knew I liked that machine and that quality and the reliability and everything. So I was so grateful to be able to have some help there in locating Jean Fabre over at Coudre Paris to be able to use that machine. So I rented it for the duration of that project to be able to do this, huge tapestry, and then also be able to use the machines to do the binding too. So it was kind of a treat to be able to use such a large machine. I had never used one that big before,
Hmm.
and it was, my mom had such a good time. She ended up getting one herself. But uh, it was really awesome to, and I think this kind of is what happens, I think, a lot at different Olympic things. So not, I mean, specific for me in my situation, I feel like this is what's happened a lot, but I've seen this happen with the other Olympian artists or other Olympic athletes in general. But there's really a community of people who are out there who want to support you in doing the thing, because
Hmm.
they the people are inherently curious and they truly want to help. And so I was endlessly surprised at how many people came to, you know, just supply different things. So, Jean went above and beyond to help us do that kind of thing, but also so did the women at the senior center, donating like, some little pins or little extra things here or there, to put into the piece, or, there's just surprises that come to you. So it was definitely a group effort, and so that's what I was talking about earlier, like the many hands.
Yep.
And you can't always see how it comes together. You have a vision of in the direction of where you want to go, but the end product, the destination, might be more colorful the more people you add.
So the universe knew this was going to happen and just made sure it did. One thing you and I had talked about before we started recording this episode was the fact that we are going to follow up with you later in the year. We want to hear about your experience at the Olympics, what this artist in residence program turned out to be. So, a promise to those sharing this conversation with us today: we will follow up with Grace, and there is certainly more to come in this story. One thing I'd like to do, we have learned about you as an athlete and your sewing and this amazing project. But I'd like to touch on something that I think is really another facet of what you do that is incredibly important. While you were in college, you received the university's Student Athlete Community Service Award because you founded Rethink Wisconsin, which is a recycling and sustainability program for on campus athletic facilities. Now, your day job, and amid all of this other that you're doing, you do have a day job, is the communications lead at the Huron Waterloo Pathways Initiative. Seems, Grace, like environmental activism is super important to you. Would you talk about the program in college, what you do now, and just share with us why this is important to you?
Yeah, good research on your part.
Thank you.
So yeah, when I was in college, well, I would back that up even further. So growing up, I grew up in the country on a very large, on 100 acres. Some of it was farm, a lot of it was habitat, and I just grew up outside. And I grew up outside, but I also grew up making things, and I grew up being active. And to me, all those things were connected and not separate endeavors. So I've seen those three threads woven together all throughout my life. And so it's funny to um, see that recognized even more so now. But yeah, when I was in college, I started out actually as an art student, but an art student, then also walk-on athlete. And I chose rowing because I wanted to do something outside. In Madison, you're on the lakes that are immediately you fall out of your dorm room and you're outside
Hmm.
on these beautiful chain of lakes. And so I picked up rowing because I wanted to continue to be outside. I started out as an art student, so I was in the making, but one of my classes I took was an environmental studies course with my professor Jack Kloppenberg, and it happened to be that there were a lot of other student athletes who were taking that class who were on the rowing team, but then a couple of others, and we were all really motivated to act. We were all in the same discussion section. We met with each other outside of class, and our professor kind of was willing to sponsor this informal group of student athletes and sports fans to try to figure out how can we make sports more sustainable within our sphere of control. So we started Rethink Wisconsin, which I believe a lot of the initiatives we started had been absorbed now into the university's Office of Sustainability, but we created the recycling program, like we talked about for, Camp Randall, this huge 80,000 person football stadium. We then had success with that for a couple of years and brought it into the Cole Center, which is the hockey and basketball area. Then implemented it to the other sports areas. But yeah, I was in the initial group of people. Eventually became co-chair of that. And there's been some really interesting other people who've been involved with it. I don't know if you know Charlie Barons. He's a Midwest comedian. He was
Hmm.
also part of that group.
Hmm.
Um, and it just started to snowball. This tie of art, communications, sports, environmentalism. And after I graduated from college, I did a couple of, freelance and consulting work to do similar things to what I do now, which is communications and try to influence people to, you know, promote an experience and really foster a love of the nature that's around them. So what I do now in my communications role with Huron Waterloo Pathway Initiative is help to engage people around this trail that runs through our county, and it connects to this network of trails that connect through the entire state of Michigan, through southeast metro parks and the Great Lakes out that direction towards Detroit and south. Because I think your love of and caring for the planet starts in your own backyard. And so promoting those relationships and connections is something I'm always really passionate about. And so I get to tie in the creativity piece with this role through just the different, posters and ads and communication assets that I create to influence people to care about this initiative. Um, so yeah, those things have connected a lot. So yeah, you're right that in college I received the community um, service award, which is awarded to one student athlete out of the entire athletic department for that work. Um, and that was a huge honor and a huge surprise because I thought it sort of flew under the radar for a while.
Hmm.
But I'm glad that it was recognized. I think it's been absorbed into the school as something that they've now institutionalized. And that kind of tied into a lot of other projects too. There was the Greenhouse Learning Community is a residential dorm all focused around environmental studies that also it came out of this initial student group. Myself and another student thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting to live these values every day as a freshman or sophomore coming into a new environment and see what could happen. So now that's its own dorm now, but it just starts with an idea. You get people on board with it, and you can see where the idea runs. So yeah, it's been interesting to be open to where these ideas can take you, whether it's, creating things like a dorm experience for students I'll never meet, to, becoming an Olympian in a sport I didn't know existed when I signed up for college.
Mhm.
And then being able to connect with this, the group of 30 women on the other side of the planet, and then hopefully meet up with them again because we created something wonderful together.
So it's pretty amazing to hear what you have done in your past. So Grace, what's next for you? What's your dream?
Well, through doing this project, I feel like I want to keep doing more creative engagement projects like this. To be able to have the opportunity to work with that many people with a huge um, brand, and in not like a commercial sense, but in a way that really sparks a lot of um, inspiration in people.
Mhm.
I found that so rewarding and really addicting, um, to just do more large scale projects. So I've done commissions here and there or little projects that people ask me to do. And I do it on the side because, I do have a day job. But I would love to be able to build this out and work with more people in large groups, whether it turn into like a team building type of experience and workshop through sewing and quilting, or being able to do some sort of like brand or team engagement, whether it be for a large, say, hospital or sports team or, anything, because at least what opened my eyes through this project was I don't have to stick to your traditional quilting materials. If this is something that's going to be on display, we live in a world where brands are really important because I think similar to the Olympics, it's something that stands for the group you're part of, whether it's the company you work for or the sports team you root for, or, your region or state or something like that. It's just an extension of yourself. It's such an interesting idea to work with. And in this day and age, everybody has branded polos and different products that have these colorways that are always matching, and then being able to assemble them in some fun way. I'm hoping I can do more with it. So hopefully people will be able to see its potential through this piece that's going to be on display during the Olympics, but then can say, I'd like to partake in a process like that and see and learn from others that I work with day in or day out, or to see what we can do. Like, we don't know what we're doing in the moment or in that day's session, but by the end, you really see how all these individual efforts add up and snowball into something really wonderful. So I hope I get to do more of it. And then other than that, I think it's just continuing on the path, seeing where this all leads me.
We talked about a lot today, a lot of things. Is there any question I didn't ask you that you wish I had?
I think, well, within the piece, I think it's interesting to note like what pieces I included of my own in this
Mhm.
quilt. Um, so because the project, and I think via a podcast, sometimes it's hard to visualize what this might look like. But when I explain it as an artistic take on a t-shirt quilt, and usually people associate t-shirts quilts with being inherently like very personal, right? And we talked about I collected items from this recycling center, which I think the interesting part about it is all of these clothing items people instantly recognize. They know what mesh looks like. They know what a performance fabric looks like, and they've maybe had some sort of fundraiser T-shirt that they've worn, or they've washed some sort of uniform at some point in their life. So they know that these were worn by an individual whose stories we may or may not know, but are relatable.
Mm.
But then for me, I ended up donating 4 pieces of my own to this project, as is typical for a t-shirt quilt, right? So the 4 pieces I included were very intentionally selected to bookend and talk about my athletic experience. And so they were great talking points while I was working with them, with the women I was working with at the senior center, to talk about my journey as, just a kid from a rural area who grew up doing maybe some dance and some things here or there. But my first organized team sport I was a part of was volleyball. So I included a t-shirt that had my high school program logo and like a number on it. So that's in the background, Northwest Volleyball. And then I found the sport of rowing as a walk-on at the University of Wisconsin. So I donated a uni. So that's the uniform that you wear in rowing. I donated one of those, and the women were all in uproar that I was ready to kind of cut it up and tear it apart. But that's the Wisconsin Red and Motion W are in those in that piece as well, because that's where I learned the sport that eventually took me to the games. The third item I put in there was a T-shirt from my last World Championships, which was the 2017 World Championships in Sarasota, Florida. And then the fourth piece I donated was an alumni T-shirt for a national team alumni row that was at the San Diego Crew Classic a couple of years after that. And I think just to show the arc of where sports started for me and where it's gone until this point, and to be able to contribute that personal touch to this piece, I think is really an opportunity to invite people to think about, well, what about this item here in the lower right hand corner? Like, what is that about, and whose story does that tell, and where did it take them? I find that that's one of the really cool, engaging things about this piece. That's opened up new discussions that sometimes when I tell people that I'm an Olympian, or they find out I'm an Olympian, sometimes the conversation just stops at that because they're just in amazement and they think it's all about sports. But then through this project, the conversation weaves through so many different unpredictable and exciting ways, because there are relatable things to it. There are relatable, like, people have tied a shoelace and there's shoelaces in there. They've maybe played a game of basketball or gone to a game and there's a basketball net in there. They've watched swimming trials and there's a swim cap in there. And so it's kind of like quilting Applebee's. Like, there's stuff all over the place that but there's a story behind that maybe you don't, that you can get curious about. So I think it's an interesting point of there being some anonymous pieces alongside these personal items that were woven into the piece.
You bring up a good point that I want to make sure we underscore is, in addition to the pieces that tell your story, every single element in what you created has been a part of an athlete's experience journey. So there is nothing in there that doesn't have a story behind it.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's very important to me personally, just because I think sometimes we think of Olympians as separate or, somehow different than the rest of us, right? And I think it's worth noting that those that you're going to be watching on TV when you're looking at the results and watching these competitions, they're human beings with, imbued with intensity, but also self-doubt. They do this sport, but they also have pets and families and partners. They do other things outside. Maybe they work. Maybe they have these other passions, and getting people to be comfortable with the nuance of that they're not just an athlete. And that's something in a perspective I felt became more and more important to me as I went through my journey. And now that I'm no longer the elite athlete in a competitive sense that I once was, it's been immensely rewarding to bring it to light through pieces like this. But then also I'm an athlete rep for the national team on our athlete council. And so bringing those different elements of representing athletes and their identities in a lot of discussions and decisions that are made about their journeys. And then also through the broadcast and announcing space, being able to, announce and cover Olympic and Paralympic trials this year was an absolute dream, because I trained with a lot of those athletes, or I had followed their path since being an athlete rep. And I know that we're only seeing them for a sliver of time in a very focused pursuit. But it's so fun and so cool to see that that's just the tip of the iceberg of all these individuals. And being able to apply that at the elite high level of the Olympic and Paralympics down to college national championships and regional championships and then high school too. I think it's really fun to see that, sports isn't just for the jocks, that those athletes and the people who watch and care about it, there are so many inroads to connecting with it. And I think that's one of the things that excites me about the Olympics, especially because I think it ropes in those people. Everyone, I think there's a little bit of a magic to it. And I think the magic is that people realize they're so connected and they are so close to that in some way or another. And it's just having conversations and seeing and exploring how close you are to it.
After experiencing this conversation with you today, I know I certainly am going to watch the games with a very different mindset, and I'm very sure our listeners will too. Grace, this has been wonderful, and I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes, thank you. It's been a joy.
Um, if our listeners would like to reach out to you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, a couple of different ways. They can either follow me or message me on Instagram, and you can find me at Grace Latz. But also, I'm currently in the process of launching a website because I've gotten a lot of inquiries about this particular project and the process that I followed. So you could also find me at gracelatz.com to see more work and hopefully more to come.
Terrific. We wish you safe travels and wonderful adventures at this year's Olympics.
Thank you.
Well, there you have it. Another story about someone just like you, someone for whom sewing and quilting is so much more than a hobby. It's a way of life and a connection to something bigger. If you know someone you think has an outstanding story, a story that should be shared on this podcast, please drop me a note to meg@soandsopodcast.com or complete the form on our website. Be sure to subscribe to, review, and rate this podcast on your favorite platform, and visit our website, soandsopodcast.com, for more information about today's and all of our guests. That's SEWANDSO podcast.com. And finally, I want to thank BERNINA for making this program possible. I'm Meg Goodman, and I look forward to you joining us next time on So and So.